So, if you watch the video, one of the things I like about I think it's an interesting video. It shows a guy who faced a real dilemma with whether or not to report, whether or not to take these photos, feeling guilty about not having intervened. I think all that's great. But one of the things I think that comes out of that is that you see this person who, at the end of the day, they ran these photos. I don't know if the public's need to know trumps this woman's last moments and showing something that was very negative in relation for the photographer who maybe just was seen as standing there. So I don't know that you would have had to run the photo. I don't necessarily think, I think what he did in that moment was reasonable, but whether or not you ran those photos, that's a good question. Because one argument is this photo should have run because it tells you the dangers of this, it shows this, it captures it. But part of it also says, here's a woman alone, dying, and you're showing pictures of it, and it also makes you look bad. And so one of the questions is, just because you get a picture doesn't mean you have to run it. Just because you have information doesn't mean you need to run it. And that's one of the questions you have. Is I can tell you, having been a journalist, that sometimes you go out and you're at a crime scene, and then the family shows up and they're telling them, and the people start breaking down crying, and they're on their knees and they're holding each other, and it's definitely, you get these images, they're powerful by all means, but that doesn't mean you need to run those images in a newspaper, online, or other things. Those are their moments of grief, and even though you've captured them, it may be best not to use it. That's one thing that an ethical journalist must ask themselves is the public's need to know, or the public's right to know, is the telling of the story, is it worth intruding on these people's moment? And that's a question you have to ask. And so, here's just one more example of this. This is a picture of a guy. This guy is in the subway. What happened was there was a gentleman, a homeless man, who was from an Asian immigrant community in New York, and this was kind of in that area of town of New York. And the guy was yelling and harassing a couple young ladies, and this older gentleman, probably in his 40s or 50s, I think he's probably around 50s, saw them, and he started yelling at him in their native language. You need to leave these ladies alone. And the guy kind of walked off, and he was standing there. And right as the train started coming in the station, this homeless guy who had some sort of mental issue came up and shoved him in. And the guy, disoriented, was trying to get out of it right as the train approached and hit and killed him. Now, this picture, you might say, well, oh my God, the photographer's just busy taking pictures. Well, two things are happening here. The photographer said he was standing there and was watching the situation and, not really doing much. He was just had his camera out. And he said when he saw this happening, he was trying to get everybody was yelling and screaming and trying to tell the train conductor about what was going on. There's a guy, and try to get him to stop. And so the photographer began to flash his camera, hoping that the train conductor would look up and see everybody waving and would realize he had to stop his train because something was wrong. But he ended up taking pictures in the process, and as a result, he captured this. When you look at the image as well, you'll also realize that this has been cropped, but originally there was a lot of real estate between him and that guy. It was at least twice the distance of sidewalk as the train is away from him. So there was absolutely no way he was going to make it in time, and this image is just that. So he captures this image by accident, gets back, looks, sees he has the image, and he has this question what to do with it. And in this case, what happened was he worked for the New York Post, and the Post like, we got to run this. This is great. This is a great image. We got to run it. They run a tabloid. They wanted to make money off of it. So they ended up using the image, and here's what they did with it. And in that regard, this is probably a pretty heinous use of this guy's last minute. As I said, you have to ask this question of whether or not you would use the image. And just because you capture doesn't mean you have to use it. You have to judge out whether or not the public's right to know, telling the story, doing something that can be very offensive, very harmful, if that is worth it. Now, I think in this regard, maybe this photo is worth using. Using it in this way strikes me as very commercialized and very much insensitive to this man's life. But the image itself, I don't know. And so you always have to ask the question. I think that using it this way was wrong. Using the image at all, I'm 50-50 on. I would entertain arguments both ways. So what I want you to do is I'm going to show you a series of about 6 or 7 images, and your job, your assignment is to answer whether or not you would run them and why. Okay? And we'll discuss it next week in class. First one is a little baby being carried out of the Oklahoma City bombing site, the Murrah Federal Building. There was a daycare when the bomb went off that was right where the bomb went off, and around 15 or 20 children died. This child does end up dying, I believe around 18 months old, and so little baby was injured. Firefighters carried out trying to get aid, does not survive, but definitely a very powerful image. Tells the story, tells what happened in a way that really is gut-wrenching and horrible and should make you want to cry, but it also tells the story and makes people realize what the story is. This is a picture of a basketball player for, I believe it was Louisville, and during the Final Four, Sweet 16 game, or Elite 8, one of the games, he jumped up for a shot. He came down and he compound fractured his leg. And as you see here, the bone is actually sticking out. There's video of it. I forget the guy's name, begins with a W, but last name. And if you find the image, you can probably just Google it if you want. But if you want to see the video, I mean, it is pretty disgusting. Now, suppose you had this image, you're running a sports page, and you want to do it. This was a pretty open thing. It was done in front of TV cameras. It was millions of people saw it. There was no secret about it. But the question is whether or not you would run this picture if you were working for a newspaper, magazine, online site. Why or why not? You could run the picture, but run it, online with, kind of a tag. If you'd like to see the picture, you could do that. But the question is whether or not this picture is worth using or not. Is there enough public interest and enough, not just public interest, public good that would come from showing such a disturbing image? This is a picture from the 1970s. This is a picture of a woman, she's around 19, and a little girl around 3 or 4. They were trying to climb down a fire escape during a fire, and the photographer was taking pictures and happened to catch as the fire escape actually collapsed and they went falling. The 19-year-old girl was killed, but the little 3 or 4-year-old did survive the fall. There had been 4 or 5 drownings at a lake in Bakersfield, Ohio, or Bakersfield, California, and this family their little boy, like around 8, had drowned, and they put him in a body bag, and the family wanted to see the body, and this is his 3 siblings, and then the father and the mother there, and they came to see it. And there was a little bit of a big debate, they said, in the newsroom about whether or not they were going to run this photo, because yeah, this is a pretty horrible image, and it also shows this family's grief and a moment of just great tragedy, and that's somewhat private, but there had also been 5 or 6 drownings, and so there was some debate about whether or not perhaps they should run this picture simply to put a human focus on what was happening, that people were not being saved, people were going swimming, there were no lifeguards, things like that, in order to more, kind of bring public awareness. So would you run it or not, and how would you do it? This is a teen, or a young man who tried to climb over a fence to get something and ended up with it through his face. It's a pretty horrific image by all means. Perhaps it could be a cautionary tale for people not to climb fences. Kid survives. Would you run it? And then that's just an image of from that video I showed you. Would you have run those? And then this is a picture of dogs being beaten and killed. There was a rabies outbreak in China, and there was a rabies outbreak in China, and so the Chinese government ordered the killing of all dogs in order to try to slow the spread. And so what they would do is they would go around, if they saw a dog out on the streets, even if it had its owner with it, they would stop, take the dog, and beat it and kill it, and then throw it into the back of a truck to dispose of in order to slow the spread of rabies. And they did this for thousands. This is an image that came through. This is a pretty disturbing image to watch people bludgeoning a dog to death, but it tells a story of something that's going on in the world that may be of some importance about the way they treat animals and the way they handle it. So let's just run through these pictures. The Oklahoma City is number 1. Number 2 is the compound fracture. Number 3 is the fire escape. Number 4 is the drowning. Number 5 is the fence climbing accident. Number 6 is the drowning from the video. And 7 and 8 are one question, and that is about using pictures of them beating and throwing away dogs. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll discuss this in class next week.